Millions of German soldiers were taken prisoner by the Soviet Union during the course of the Second World War. Estimates on the number of men involved vary depending on the sources. Soviet sources claim approximately 2.4 million German prisoners, while German figures estimate that there were closer to 3.5 million German POWs taken. Some of this discrepancy is accounted for because of the German figures include soldiers captured from other Axis forces, including Hungarians, but for the most part, the million-man difference is simply because of large gaps in proper record-keeping due to the chaos of war. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. The large-scale capture of German soldiers by the Soviet Union began with the encirclement and defeat of Germany at Stalingrad and continued apace until the final defeat of Germany in 1945. German soldiers knew that conditions in Soviet captivity would be harsh, to say the least, and whenever possible, they would opt to surrender to the Western Allies, where captivity would be better. The Western Allies, however, in the interests of maintaining cordial working relations, while the war was still being fought, and in the hopes of avoiding direct conflict once Germany was defeated, handed to the Soviets thousands of German POWs. Less well known was the prisoner of war situation in East Asia, as Japan surrendered. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan in the very last days of the war in Asia, not anticipating the sudden surrender of Japan in the wake of the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner by the Soviet Union as the Red Army occupied Manchuria, Korea, the Kuril Islands, and the Sakhalin Islands. So this puts perhaps as many as 4.5 million prisoners of war in the hands of the Soviet Union. How were they treated? What were their living conditions like? What did they do as prisoners? Let's answer these questions. Let's start off by quickly outlining where, geographically, the POWs were being held. Although there's some overlap, most Japanese POWs remained in Siberia and the Russian Far East, while German POWs were held in European Russia, up to the Ural Mountains. This isn't a vital piece of information, but might help give some orientation as we talk about various specific geographic locations. Both German and Japanese prisoners were used as a source of free labor for the Soviet Union. Japanese POWs were heavily involved in the construction of large infrastructure projects. They built new housing projects and industrial facilities in places such as Irkutsk, Khabarovsk, Vladivostok, and Tashkent. They were a vital part of the construction of the Baikal-Amur Main Line, a strategic rail line that ran parallel to the Trans-Siberian Line, but further to the north, away from the Chinese border. According to Soviet figures, 26% of Japanese POWs were sent to work in forest and logging industries, 23.5% in mining, including in the Donbass in European Russia, 12.2% in agricultural work, and a little over 16% to heavy industry and industrial and civil construction projects. These figures make sense when you consider the relative underdevelopment of Asian Russia. Forests and mining were the dominant industries. So, what was happening in European Russia with the German POWs? To quote the Soviet foreign minister at the end of the war, Vyacheslav Molotov, German POWs will stay in the Soviet Union until Stalingrad is rebuilt. And they did rebuild Stalingrad, the city famously destroyed during the war. Of course, German POWs were put to work all over. They worked to build the Georgian oil industry, they built airports and housing in Vilnius and Tallinn in the Baltic republics. They were forced to labor in the coal mines of the Donbass and to build housing and public infrastructure all around the country, including in Leningrad and Moscow. The use of German prison labor was so widespread in 1947, it was estimated that every sixth worker building electrical stations and every fourth person involved in the production of construction materials was a German laborer. Crucially, for the Soviet armaments industry, 20% of metallurgy workers and 30% of the aviation industry were Germans. German industrial expertise was being used to propel the Soviet arms industry forward, while at the same time captured German scientists were put to work in the Soviet nuclear and ballistic rockets programs. So now we have an idea of where these POWs were and what, generally, they were doing. So let's talk about what life was like for these prisoners. In short, conditions were gruesome. They often were working 10 to 14-hour days despite the official requirement that they were only to work 8 hours. And keep in mind, this didn't include the amount of time required for them to walk to their work site, which could be anywhere from 5 to 18 kilometers away from their camp. The Soviet Union was ill-prepared for the rapid influx of such a large number of prisoners, and lacked sufficient accommodations. As a result, the accommodations that did exist were both overcrowded and in poor condition. For many of the Japanese POWs, at the start of their captivity, there were actually no camps at all, and they were forced to sleep in the open air. This, combined with the fact that they were not provided warm clothing, meant that illness and disease began to run rampant among the POWs. If you've ever spent one night sleeping outside with no shelter, you know how cold that can be. Now imagine doing that for weeks and even months. As for what the prisoners ate, on paper they were fed quite well, as they were supposed to get 300 to 400 grams of bread, 300 grams of rice, and 100 grams of grain, as well as 50 to 100 grams of meat or fish, 600 grams of vegetables, and up to 20 grams of sugar per day. Of course, this was just on paper. In reality, even most Soviet citizens didn't eat that well. Now, there was a difference, even on paper, between how much food the Japanese prisoners would receive compared to what the German prisoners received. The Japanese portion received daily cost an average of 4.06 rubles, while a German prisoner would get food that only cost 2.94 rubles. It's 25% less. After December of 1947, there was some revision to the food program, where the Japanese POWs were being fed food costing an average of 11.27 rubles per day, while the German POWs, although they were getting more food than before, it only came to 6.35 rubles per day, almost half of the Japanese portion. So why this stark difference? While the Soviet Union had only gone to war with Japan in the very last moment before their surrender, they'd been at war with Germany since 1941, locked in a bitter struggle for survival. The Germans were seen by both Soviet soldiers and citizens as fascist invaders and occupiers that had brought hardship, death, and destruction to the motherland. The deep animosity, hatred even, towards the Germans that had been built up over years of bitter fighting simply didn't exist towards the Japanese. At the end of the day, the difference in the Soviet treatment of prisoners from the two nations can be seen most starkly in the number of prisoner deaths. While Soviet sources claim that there were approximately 350,000 German prisoner deaths out of a total of 2.4 million prisoners, about 15%, German sources claim a death toll of around 1.3 million deaths out of 3.5 million prisoners. That's about 37%. Now, compare this with the death rate among Japanese POWs. Depending on the estimates used of the total number of prisoners and the number of deaths recorded, the death toll among the Japanese prisoners was as low as 12%. This is a staggering difference, but it's directly related to the overall treatment of prisoners received at the hands of their Soviet jailers. Of course, the Soviets took the opportunity to not only work their prisoners into the ground, literally, as we've just discussed, they also spent time trying to indoctrinate them and turn them into assets to serve the Soviet state in the future. Even as early as 1943, these indoctrination programs had begun with the creation of the Free German National Committee in Krasnogorsk. It was headed by the German immigrant poet and communist Erich Weinert, as well as some other German officers that had been taken prisoner. The aim of the committee was to bring about the end of the Nazi regime in Germany. At the same time, the Union of German Officers was established, whose goal was to conduct anti-Nazi propaganda campaigns among German prisoners. Included in the ranks of this union was Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the German 6th Army that had surrendered at Stalingrad. The union quickly accepted the aims of the Free German Committee and was soon absorbed into it. The Free Germany Committee was instrumental in the establishment of the German democratic government, and especially its armed forces. POWs participated in anti-fascist schools and were provided with pro-Soviet, and by default anti-capitalist, literature. Re-education classes were held in all of the camps, led by the political departments that were also in each and every camp. The indoctrination itself did not lead to significant results among the majority of prisoners. Although upwards of 70% of POWs took part in these ideological re-education classes, many were just doing it to take advantage of better food rations, reduced working hours, the ability to send more letters home, and even the opportunity for early repatriation back home. For those prisoners, however, that did take the classes seriously, they could be sent for further ideological training in larger centers in Moscow, Khabarovsk, Krasnoyarsk, and other large cities. These prisoners were then sent back to the camps to act as ideological instructors. For other prisoners, and also after their release, it was hoped they would act in the interests of socialism once back home. But how effective was this really? Although there were some recorded cases of Japanese POWs singing the Internationale on the ships sailing home, for the most part it would seem prisoners were quite indifferent to the propaganda. Activists were thoroughly investigated upon their return home and ultimately provided very little real help back to the Soviet Union. So, since we've already mentioned repatriation, we should talk about what that looked like. It was often a long and painful process for the German prisoners, but by 1947 it was underway. The first to be released and sent home were the weakest and the most ill. And before you assume that this was a humanitarian gesture, let's be honest, they were not fit to work and still needed to be fed and provided for. Of course the Soviets would release them first. According to a letter from Molotov to Stalin written in 1947, up to 800,000 German POWs had already been sent back to Germany, and by 1949, when the German Democratic Republic was created, there were only an approximate 85,000 POWs left in the Soviet camps. These remaining prisoners had mostly been convicted as war criminals and given long labor sentences, up to 25 years. It wasn't until the 1956 intervention of the West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer that the last of these war convicts were actually repatriated. As for the Japanese POWs, repatriation began as early as 1946, when almost 20,000 prisoners were released. This followed with further releases year over year, with the majority of them being sent home between 1947 and 1949. The last remaining Japanese POWs weren't sent home, however, until 1956, when an agreement was finally signed between the Soviet Union and Japan regarding the actual end of the war. Even before the end of the war, Stalin had told the Allies that he would need up to 4 million prisoners to be used in the reconstruction. And this was built into the agreement made at Potsdam regarding reparations. The cheap, almost free labor that those prisoners provided was instrumental for the reconstruction of the Soviet economy and advancement of scientific technology, as the nation pursued its goal of being a global superpower. We'll discuss all this in future videos, so make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War channel, and we will catch you on the next one.